Welcome back. We wanted to take a few minutes tonight to talk about some stories that just aren't getting a lot of attention right now, like the stock market. Stocks continue to get hammered, and the trade war with China is one of the reasons why. Also, things continue to go downhill with North Korea. So, lots to talk about with Gordon Chang. He is the author of The Coming Collapse of China and Nuclear Showdown: North Korea Takes on the World. Gordon, let's start with the major headline on the U.S. foreign policy front, and that, of course, the resignation of Defense Secretary James Mattis and questions about the direction of U.S. foreign policy moving forward. What's your focus on how that could impact our relations with nations across Asia?
Well, nations across Asia are going to look at Mattis as sort of this tower of stability, as people in the U.S. do. But, we also got to remember that Mattis's China policy was perhaps too conventional. So, for instance, he vetoed a State Department proposal to put Marine Guards at the new AIT facility in Taipei. That, I think, was a real mistake. It signaled to the Chinese that we were afraid of them. So I think we need a defense secretary who has got a more forward posture than Mattis did. The other thing that Mattis did, which I think was unsettling, at least to some people in the Navy, is that he allowed the Ronald Reagan Strike Group to actually have a port call in Hong Kong right after the Chinese had denied us the facilities. I think that was a mistake on Mattis's part. So I'm looking for a more resolute defense secretary, because the challenge from China is the most important thing right now to the United States. And we need someone who is going to be more vigorous in defending American and international interests than Mattis was.
There have been some military, I don't want to say standoffs, but certainly we've positioned some warships in position near China to try to influence some of their positioning. So there has been some physical interaction. There's also, of course, the trade war and the trade threats, which are impacting the markets and the economy and the relationship. How big of a moment is this right now in the U.S.-Chinese relationship, and what are you watching for as to what happens next?
Yeah, this is another crucial moment because a lot of questions or issues are coming to a head. As we see, for instance, with the so-called trade war, which is an attempt to remedy the theft of Chinese intellectual property and to get them to stop their pernicious trade violations. Also, we have the detention in Vancouver of the Huawei chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou. And she was detained at U.S. request because apparently the Justice Department criminal investigation of Huawei has uncovered a number of very unsettling behaviors. So there's a lot going on right now. The U.S. has tried to ignore some very dangerous Chinese conduct over the course of decades. And now I think it's a point where the United States can't ignore it anymore. And we've got to do something about these to defend our society. So, of course, there's going to be a lot of friction. There's going to be much more friction. But that's sort of necessary because, you can't have these relations where we just don't take into account and don't deal with some very, very unsettling Chinese actions.
I want to get back to China in just a moment, time permitting. But first, I want to ask about North Korea, because they're now refusing to denuclearize unless the U.S. removes its nuclear threat, in their words, which would be bombers and submarines, because we don't have any nuclear weapons left in South Korea. But that's not going to happen. We're not going to stand down. So, this feels like Trump's efforts with North Korea have failed or are failing. Do you agree with that assessment?
I agree that they are failing. They haven't failed yet. We got to remember that President Trump was extraordinarily successful through about the middle of May. He was getting the North Koreans to make all the concessions, and he was making none of his own. And then he decided to create this good atmosphere so that Kim Jong-un would feel secure enough to give up his weapons. And so we didn't go ahead, for instance, with sanctioning a number of North Korean front companies. And I think that signaled to Kim Jong-un a sort of like a failure of will. Now, it wasn't, but that's the way he perceived it. And, at the present time, we have the U.S. not exerting maximum pressure on the North Koreans. We need to do that. And we also need to exert maximum pressure on the Chinese, the Russians, and the South Koreans, all who've been openly violating UN rule.
I'm curious where we stand in this trade showdown with China, because earlier this month there were reports of a break in the trade war. China said they'd agree to help with fentanyl and buy some additional U.S. products, and the Trump administration delayed additional tariffs going on. And then we hear in the month of November, China bought 0 U.S. soybeans, which is going to impact a lot of red state and red state farmers. I don't know whether we were closer to the end of this thing than the beginning, or whether there's positive news or not. What's your take?
Well, we probably will have some sort of trade agreement after the 90-day truce, because everyone seems to want it. I believe that is a deeply mistaken approach. We've just been doing this before. We have agreements with China, and China violates them even as the ink dries. So what we need to do is impose costs on China and keep those costs in place until the Chinese stop aberrant behavior. So they've got to stop stealing our intellectual property. They've got to stop violating their WTO, World Trade Organization obligations. They got to just stop all of this stuff. And then after that, then we take off the penalties like the tariffs or whatever. But that's the only way to deal successfully with China. We haven't learned that. We should have learned that. Because we know we've tried the generous approach. It just has failed time after time after time.
But even if that medicine hurts us in the short term because of the impact on our economy or on our farmers or on our consumers, you still think it's worth it to inflict that short-term pain for what you think will be long-term progress with China?
Well, if we want to become an economy that sells nothing but agricultural products and scrap metal, yeah, then we can sort of say we're not going to accept any pain. But you got to remember that you can't have decades of misguided trade policy with Beijing and expect that we're going to get out of this with with no hurt. China is stealing our intellectual property. That's our future. If we want to have an innovation-based economy, we've got to commercialize our innovation, and we've got to stop China from stealing it. Otherwise, we become very much an also-ran economy with no Googles, no Microsofts, no Amazons, no nothing, because they'll all be Chinese. So, yeah, we've got a choice. We can decide not to take any medicine at all, but that would be a deeply wrong choice for us. That would mean no future for Americans.
Gordon Chang is an Asia expert and an author. Gordon, appreciate a few minutes. Enjoy the holiday season.
Thank you.
And after the break, we're going to lighten things up a bit. Movies like Love Actually, A Christmas Story, and It's a Wonderful Life. Of course, they are considered holiday classics, but that doesn't mean they were always that well regarded. Michael Musto joins us to explain right after this.